Long Island, 2010. Gilgo Beach is quiet. Cold wind moving across empty sand dunes, dark waves crashing along the shore, and long stretches of highway surrounded by nothing but brush and darkness. But hidden just beyond the roadside, something horrifying is about to be uncovered. One by one, police begin discovering the remains of a woman who had vanished years earlier without a trace. Search teams flood the area. Helicopters circle overhead. Flashing police lights cut through the night as fear spreads across New York. No witnesses. No clear suspect. Just a growing list of missing women. And the terrifying possibility that a serial killer had been hunting in secret for years.
Welcome to Unlawful Acts, the podcast where we dive into the darkest corners of true crime, unearthing the shocking and often hidden stories behind the world's most infamous criminals. I'm Susan Davis, your host.
And I'm your co-host, Jocelyn Frankhuizen.
So this episode begins where most people have just been hearing about Gilgo Beach. Doesn't begin with a confession, and it doesn't begin with an arrest, but with a search for one missing woman that would lead police to something much bigger.
For years, Gilgo Beach felt like a case that would never end. In this episode, we're walking through all of it. We're going to take a look at the beach and the victims, and we're also going to unpack the investigation that had years of dead ends, remains found in fragments, in clusters, in different years, the suburban family life, also the burner phones, the pizza crust evidence. Some victims were identified quickly, and some lived as Jane Does for years. And that's the part that scares me the most, is the fact that the killer was actually not hiding at all and was living his normal life in plain sight. The man tied to those murders, as of April 2026, stood up in a courtroom and confessed to what so many people had known for years. Rex Heuermann pled guilty to 7 murders and admitted killing an 8th woman, Karen Vergata.
So on May 1st of 2010, they're out looking for Shannon Gilbert, who had vanished after a frantic 911 call. The police are out in the marshes in Gilgo Beach, and a canine officer actually comes upon some hidden remains. Those remains were not the remains of Shannon Gilbert. Instead, they actually were Melissa Bartholomew's remains. And 2 days later, police found 3 more. One belonged to Maureen Brainard Barnes, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello, Those 4 women would then become known as the Gilgo Four.
Shannon Gilbert's disappearance helped lead police to the remains that were found in Gilgo Beach. And authorities have said that they do not believe that she was murdered.
So then the case widens. Through the spring of 2011, police are still searching through Gilgo Beach, and they find more remains, bringing the total to 10. They weren't sure whether they had one killer or multiple killers, but they end up finding a total of 10 bodies in the Gilgo Beach area. Among those remains were Jessica Taylor, Valerie Mack, and Karen Vergata. So this is what sort of makes Gilgo Beach unsettling. It wasn't just one single geography of fear. It was like a barrier island, a marsh, if you will, that is covered in tall grass, wetlands, and they're finding bodies all over this area. The story was in pieces for a long time.
And investigators, once they began putting the pieces together, they immediately saw a pattern amongst the victims. Every woman that was murdered was petite and in their 20s, and they had been working online, they had been working as escorts where they were propositioning their business online. 3 of them were found wrapped in burlap, and they had all disappeared after having contact with burner phones. It did not look random. In fact, this looked completely deliberate. It was methodical. It was very well thought out. And the pattern was so identifiable that it looked like perhaps this person was capable of doing exactly the same thing again and again and again.
Right, exactly. So then the first murder was actually Sandra Costilla. Heuermann met her in 1993. He picked her up and strangled her and left her remains near Fish Cove in Southampton. And then hunters actually found her remains, if you will, around November of 1993. She was only 28 years old, and when her body was found, she was actually found, her arms were up above her head with her torso sort of covered, partially by the shirt that she was wearing. But she had these deep cuts in her face, her torso, her breasts, and even along her thighs and vaginal area. And so it was a pretty gruesome scene that they came upon when they found her body.
It's truly difficult to get the words out to articulate this story because of how horrific it is. So I want to do justice to the victims and maintain my accuracy, so bear with me as I rely on my notes. I want you to understand that what makes the Gilgo Beach murders hit so deeply hard is that Rex Heuermann's outward life did not look anything like the life of a hunted serial killer. This was a man that was living in New York State. He had a family, he had children, he had a career. He had graduated from New York Institute of Technology in 1987. He was living in Massapequa Park, where he had grown up, in fact, in the same house that he had grown up in with his parents, with his wife, and he had children. In fact, he had a daughter, which makes all of this even that much more disturbing. This was a person that truly had an entire life that was built out in the New York suburbs, and that is a fact that stands out extremely significantly once the case is laid out in full, because prosecutors later argued that several of the murders actually happened in Massapequa Park when Rex Heuermann's wife and children were out of state. So before we even get to the murders themselves, the shape of the case is already truly disturbing. This is a man that has a professional identity. He has a home life. He has a marriage. He has children, meetings that happened in Midtown, a business in Manhattan. He lived a quiet suburban life, but beneath it all, he lived a very significant double life that was built on burner phones, surveillance, violence, and a routine that ran for years and years.
Yeah, so then after Sandra Costilla, then came Karen Vergata. She was killed in April of 1996. It's an important point in the timeline because he was never accused or arrested for killing her. The investigators didn't know anything about her, but he would later confess to killing her in court. She was picked up just like the other ones. He strangled her. In this case, he dismembered her body and transported her body parts to different locations. Her severed torso, if you will, were found in an expanded area of Gilgo Beach, and her severed legs and body parts were also found in an area called Blue Point Beach. They were found separately, though. So her legs that had been deposited in Blue Point Beach in 1996, those were found first. And then like in 2011, they found her skull, her forearms, I think some of her, one of her hands. And then she was later identified by genetic genealogy, DNA, and as far as 2023. So there was this huge span of time before after she was killed and actually identified, which was very similar in the other killings that took place in Gilgo Beach. She was 34 at the time of her death. She was a sex worker, but she was never sexually assaulted. So that was a little confusing for the investigators. But for years, there was no connection had been made between her and the Gilgo Beach murders.
And these forensic details are truly disturbing. What I think is really interesting is that old evidence can suddenly become extremely significant when forensic technology actually catches up to real time. In fact, there was a male hair that was recovered from Amber Castilla's remains that was more likely to have come from that was more likely to come from a person with the exact DNA match as Rex Heuermann than any other individual. And a separate analysis also tied a female's hair to the victim that had been found on her body to a woman that had lived in Heuermann's home previously.
Yeah, so Valerie Mack was one of the next victims. She was only known as Jane Doe for about 20 years. They had no idea who she was. She was killed sometime between September and November of 2000. She was a sex worker. Rex Heuermann picked her up, strangled her, decapitated her, and severed both her hands, one of her legs, and then wrapped everything with rope and burlap and deposited at different locations. He put her torso and those remains in an area called Manderville, which is near Gilgo Beach, but it's more of a wooded area. And then he took the rest of it to Gilgo Beach and deposited it there. They finally identified her years later through analysis of the DNA. They found her foot on Gilgo Beach, and they started to put all the pieces of the puzzle together. So, and then Jessica Taylor, she was 20 years old. She was the next victim. She vanished in July of 2003, and then this is while she was working as a sex worker. She was the youngest victim that Rex Heuermann had reached out to. And then, like many other victims, he picked her up and dismembered her. They found her body parts in 2 separate locations. She was last seen actually at the Port Authority bus terminal. That's actually located in Midtown Manhattan, which sort of fits with his locale as well.
With his office.
Yeah. She'd been staying with this woman. She actually had a car breakdown when she was in Washington, D.C. It's really not known why she was there, but she was forced to hitchhike back.
Wow.
And so then when she left, she had been staying with some people in the Bronx that she didn't know them very well, but they took her in and let her stay there. And so when she left that day, they noted that she had her cell phone. She was wearing these red-heeled sandals. So that was something that they noted in the file. She had her purse and her Bible with her. And that's the last time they ever saw her. She was picked up, strangled, she was dismembered, and parts of her body were taken to Manorville, and other parts were taken to that area in Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach. Her arms, her hands had been severed, and were missing from the parts, but her torso was actually found. This is kind of gruesome, but her torso was actually found sitting on a plastic, kind of like a plastic bag in Manorville.
So disturbing. And that was found completely separately from the rest of her body.
Right, exactly. They found her skull and part of, I think, her hands in about 8 years later. And so that was really I can't imagine coming along and then there's a human torso sitting on a plastic bag in the middle of the woods. And so, the hunters found her in the Manorville area. So,
And the discovery gap is so significant amongst not just her, but amongst all of the other victims in this case. I mean, we're talking body parts found almost 15 years apart.
Right.
And that just tells you how scattered this entire investigation was. You know, why did it stop and start so many times? Why did it, not have a consistent pulse? What was lacking in the evidence? What hadn't been discovered? And I think that we should take a second to say that Karen Vergata actually existed in evidence for many, many years as Jane Doe. And during those times, no connection of her and her discovery had been made to the Gilgo Beach murders.
It wasn't even made when they found the Gilgo 4. Or any of the other girls. They had no idea that she had any connection to the case because, again, they didn't identify her body until 2023.
Correct.
Or her identity until 2023, although they had found her much, much earlier. So it was, it was, I think, a shock to them when Rex Heuermann walks into court and says, yeah, I killed her too.
And I think that it's just absolutely hard to believe that that connection wasn't made just by coincidence. And we'll get into that a little bit later.
Yeah, so, Maureen Brainard Barnes was actually the one who disappeared first of the Gilgo 4. She disappeared in July of 2007. She was a hardworking mom who had several jobs. I mean, she was a cashier. She dealt cards. She was a card dealer at a casino. She did telemarketing, but it just wasn't enough to make ends meet.
She did everything she could.
Yeah, she had 2 children that she had to support, so she turned to sex work to take care of her young son and daughter. She put an ad on Craigslist, and then she would travel from Connecticut to Manhattan every other weekend or so to make a living. And so she stayed in budget hotels when she was there. And then after seeing an online advertisement, of course, Rex Heuermann reaches out to her. He would end up contacting her about 16 times before they finally met up. And of course, the theory is that they were negotiating price and place and all of those things. Now, the calls took place over the weekend from July 6th through the 9th of 2007. She was actually believed to be involved, of course, negotiating with her price and what have you. But she was recorded shortly before midnight of July 9th of 2007, where she called a friend of hers and says, look, I'm going on this out call you in the morning, that whole stay safe, take care of you sort of conversation.
Totally.
And then of the night of July 9th, Heuermann picked her up, strangled her, and then he tied up her remains with 3 belts that you would have around your waist.
That's right.
So he tied her up with these 3 belts, transported her body to the Ocean Parkway strip along Gilgo Beach, and then her remains were found there with the other Gilgo 4 girls in December of 2010. So then a few days after she disappeared in July of 2007, a man actually called her close friend Sarah Carnes from a block number, which they now know was a burner phone. And then he claimed to have seen her at this brothel in the Bronx. And so Sarah sort of asked him some questions. He brought up her identifying tattoos because apparently she's had some tattoos on her hands. And so he described her, brought up the tattoos to sort of give him credibility. And then Sarah asked him, okay, so you saw her at a brothel. Where's this brothel? Do you have the address? Do you know where it is? And he assured her that he knew the address. He, had it written down somewhere, and he would call her back and give it to her, but he never called again. So, and excuse me. And so investigators were again found her as part of the group that was found called the Gilgo 4. So.
Investigators said forensic anthropologists had found similarities between the cutting instruments that were used on Valerie Mack and Jessica Taylor, specifically a hand-powered saw that had a similar blade width, and prosecutors argued that they were aligned with Valerie Mack's condition. The investigators would later find in 2024 a male hair on surgical tape that was underneath Jessica's body. And that hair, again, had matched almost identically forensically to Rex Heuermann at odds that would match him more likely than anyone else. Heuermann targeted women who were often working as sex workers, and publicly, as you've described, the most common method of murder was death by strangulation and then dismemberment. That brings our story to 2007, where most people are familiar with it at the Gilgo 4.
Yeah, Melissa Bartholomew actually disappeared in July of 2009.
Mm-hmm.
She had gone to New York. She was going to become a hairdresser. Why she chose New York for that, I have no idea. But she ended up becoming a sex worker. And so what she would do, she would walk along the Times Square sort of area. There was some, there were some strip clubs along that Times Square area. And she would solicit men for sex in that area. She had actually paid for a lookout to keep an eye on her, have her back in case she got into any trouble. But then she decided that she was going to go it alone. So she puts an ad on Craigslist, and she gave up her lookout, if you will. And she was contacted from one of the burner phones from the Craigslist ad. And so this gentleman offered her $1,000 to meet with him. So, of course, how's she going to turn that down at that time? Well, it still is a pretty good amount of money for however long they end up working. So in July of 2009, she negotiates the price with this guy, agrees to meet him. He picks her up that evening, and she was never seen again. He strangled her. He tied her remains with burlap and transported her body to Gilgo Beach. Her remains were discovered along with the other girls on December 11th of 2010. She was actually the first of the Gilgo 4 to be found. So her dismembered remains were found in a cluster. They were all together on Gilgo Beach. And then there was Megan Waterman. She had a difficult childhood growing up. She grew up in foster homes, which she turned to her brother Greg, and they were very close. She had a baby at 18, and by 22, she was really upside down financially. So she turned to sex work to take care of her child. And so according to her brother, she would go to New York a couple weekends a month from her home in Maine, and she typically would travel by bus with her boyfriend Akeem Cruz, and they would go and they would stay in these budget hotels while she did her job, and then they would come home. Well, in this particular case, they were staying at a Holiday Inn Express, and she was seen on surveillance video leaving the hotel, and they connected. She had a call right before that from a burner phone. She gets into a car at the Holiday Inn Express. This is about 1 o'clock in the morning. And then they actually had another hit on her phone at about 3 o'clock in the morning in Massapequa Park. And so it all sort of fit into her final trip, if you will, in 2010. So after being captured on the surveillance footage, she leaving the hotel. That's the last cell site. Between that and the Massapequa Park connection was the last time that they were able to pick up anything. But prosecutors said that a male hair was covered from her remains, and that was later tied to DNA to Rex Heuermann. So it would become, actually those hairs that were found within her remains would become one of the biggest parts of the forensic evidence was found in the case. So it was a super important find. Now, Megan's family didn't give up looking for her. They didn't feel like the police were taking her disappearance seriously because she was a sex worker. So her brother would go downtown New York. He would hand out flyers. He would talk to people. He would show her picture to people trying to find her. And he and one of Megan's friends actually sold all of their possessions and went to New York in an effort to find her. But of course, they never did. So, and then Amber Costello, she disappeared in September of 2010. And her case turned out to be one of the biggest investigative breaks in the whole file. She was contacted from a burner phone on her Craigslist ad by a man, who would call her several times. They ended up talking for great lengths of time. Her roommate said that they would sometimes have calls a half an hour or so in length. So she had a habit of, or her MO really was to scam her Johns.
Yes.
She would have them meet her at her house. And then what they would do is they would, one of her roommates, she had two male roommates. One was Dave Schuler, and the other one really was never named in the case. But what they would do is when the client, if you will, would get to the house, they'd get in, they'd pay their money, they'd do the hi, how are you, the little kind of small talk. And then one of the roommates would come in and pretend to be an outraged boyfriend and chase off the client, and Amber would keep the money.
And this is something that she did regularly that had worked many times in the past.
Exactly. Now, Dave, who was the one involved in this particular scam, he noticed that there was a Chevy, like a new edition Chevy Avalanche in the driveway. But she described the guy as being like unusually tall. He was 6'4", 6'6". He had dark, bushy hair, big, thick glasses. And he sort of described him as ogre-like. And so despite this confrontation, the man was allowed to leave. And then he actually texted her on later that evening and said, you've got my money, do I get a credit for what I've already paid for? And he essentially said, well, that wasn't nice. Do I get a credit for next time?
I thought that was so creepy. That was
Very creepy.
Was not nice.
That wasn't nice.
That wasn't nice.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like I'm going to get you if
it
you
does.
ask me.
Absolutely.
So the next night, she's contacted again by this man, and because of some of the extended conversations that she'd had, she'd, like Dave said, she'd talked to him for quite a period of time. She told Dave that she felt comfortable, leaving with this man. He didn't want to meet her at the house because of the prior confrontation. He didn't want to have that confrontation again with her boyfriend, and so he suggested that they leave the house and go someplace else. And then he said, well, I'd feel more comfortable if you would leave your cell phone and your purse behind. And for some reason, she did just that. She walked out the front door and was never seen alive again.
It's so crazy to me that she makes the decision to leave her phone and her purse behind.
Exactly.
Because some man tells her to, against her intuition and against a plan and a job that she had had for a very long time.
Well, she'd already scammed this guy.
Exactly.
I mean, it's such an odd request in my mind. But he picked her up, and again, she was strangled. Her remains were tied up just similarly to the other girls, and were dumped on Gilgo Beach. And her remains were found in December of 2010, on the 13th of December, with the other girls, and she was part of the final Gilgo 4 girl to be found that year. So
the patterns that occurred with the burner phone in this case are extremely significant and actually were some things that tied each of these victims together and allowed prosecutors and investigators to piece together the facts about what happened. There were direct phone calls that occurred from these burner phones to some of the victims and their families. And in the case of Maureen, prosecutors actually alleged that 3 days after her disappearance, Heuermann used Maureen's own cell phone to check her voicemail. According to District Attorney Ray Turney, Heuermann used fake online identities to track the social media accounts and activities of the victims' families, including Maureen's. This, to me, is so disgusting.
Yeah.
This man wanted to make sure that he was leaving an impact on the victims' families. And what happens next really takes it to the next level. As the story continues, new details about the patterns with the burner phones surface. And this next story about the burner phones, to me, is just the most mind-blowing. In the case of Melissa's disappearance, investigators said that her phone was used again after her disappearance to check her voicemail, and later he made taunting calls to her family members. Most interestingly, he made taunting phone calls to her 15-year-old sister, Amanda, which it's truly hard for me to talk about. So bear with me while I get through it, because these phone calls are disturbing. You have to remember that this is a grown man who had just killed the sister of a 15-year-old girl. And at least on one occasion, when he called and was taunting Amanda, the 15-year-old sister, he hung up when the mother jumped on the phone and what I would understand would be desperately trying to get in touch with the person who was on the other line. It's exceptionally disturbing because these phone calls were deliberate, and the person on the other line, who we believe to be Rex Heuermann, actually described to 15-year-old Amanda how he had killed her sister, how he had assaulted her, that he was watching her sister rot for 3 days after she had disappeared. And again, it's just so disturbing that I can barely get the words out, because I think about being on the receiving end of these phone calls, being in a position where you've just lost your sister, you're 15 years old, and now a man is calling your cell phone incessantly, saying that he has done unspeakable things to her.
Yeah, I think that was kind of like the pleasure of the control and the trauma that he could now invoke on the family because he had their phones.
Truly. And, you know, he's using vulgar language as well during these phone calls. He's calling Melissa a whore, and he had asked younger sister Amanda if she thought that she would ever see her sister again. And again, he had also said that he had sexually assaulted her sister, that he had killed her, was describing to the 15-year-old how he killed her. And the last call in August 26, 2009, the caller told Amanda, "I am watching your sister rot." So all of these phone calls that occurred from the burner phones, including the ones that were made to Amanda's younger sister, Melissa's younger sister, Amanda, were typically under 3 minutes in total, which is a tactic that investigators believed was utilized to make these phone calls untraceable. And this is a very deliberate thing that Rex Heuermann was doing to avoid being traced in real time, and did not know that he was in fact being traced at all. However, using cell tower data, police later traced the calls to crowded areas of Midtown Manhattan, specifically near Penn Station, Times Square, Madison Square Garden, all of these places that were near his office.
Right.
And it's just baffling to me that this didn't come up for years and years and years. These calls were particularly haunting because at the time that they were made, one of the victims, Melissa, her body had not been found or discovered yet, and it actually wasn't discovered for 17 months after the calls were made in December of 2010. Coming up, we were going to dig into what happened behind the scenes inside the Suffolk County Police Department that caused investigators to halt this investigation for nearly a decade.
Yeah, I mean, this investigation stalled for like 10 years.
Yes.
The investigation into after the Gilgo Four were found. And so you have to ask yourself, why was it stalled? Well, it turns out that the entire precinct had become embroiled in an investigation into the police chief, Burke. Burke had beaten a suspect. Now, this suspect had broken into his car. It wasn't his personal car, it was his squad car. He broke into the trunk and he pulled out the burlap bag. And what they found in the bag were sex toys, pornography, a gun belt, and items that were extremely both embarrassing for Burke and could have gotten him either, in trouble or actually released from his job. So then there's this big cover-up that takes place. He actually gets the then district attorney, Thomas Spoda, to participate with them on this. So they conspired to not only cover up beating up this guy who had broken into the car, but they also made all the investigators and the officers in the precinct kind of go along with their story. So now they're intimidating everybody in the workforce to go along with their story, and so nothing's really getting done at the precinct because they're dealing with this story. In December of 2013. The FBI actually and the district attorney's office in the Central District of New York actually launched an investigation. And then what happened is, as a result, both Burke and Spoda received jail time. I think Burke received like 46 months for his participation. And then Spoda actually got 5 years and a $100,000 fine. I think that's probably because he's an officer of the court. And he had participated not only in the cover-up, but the conspiracy to intimidate everybody and kind of brush it under the rug when his job really was to prosecute. So it was a long time sentence for him and quite a large fine. So then finally, in 2022, now, gosh, we are 12 years past when these girls were found?
Yes.
Suffolk County Police Commissioner Rodney Harrison and the then District Attorney Ray Turney, they launched a new investigation and started a new task force to re-examine all of the evidence in the Gilgo murder case. And they actually had an FBI report that had been sitting around for years where the FBI had actually connected all the calls to the cell towers and sort of geographically gave them an idea of where all of that was coming from. And so because of that, about 6 weeks later, they really had identified Heuermann as a suspect for the first time. The case, it didn't suddenly solve itself. It was just that somebody actually cared enough to look at the evidence again.
And this is where the pieces of the puzzle finally are starting to come together and old clues are beginning to resurface. The renewed review led investigators to the discovery of the old truck, the Chevy Avalanche, that had been identified back in 2010, nearly 12 years before the case was renewed.
The investigators actually created what they called a box. It was like this geographic area of Massapequa Park. And again, it was based on the FBI report that they got. And many of the burner phones were all connected to that area. And as you mentioned, the calls from downtown Manhattan and Midtown, the small radius combined again with that Chevy Avalanche. And then, of course, there was a physical description that matched, Heuermann to a T. And so the investigators then said, okay, now he works in this area of Midtown Manhattan. We've got the area that surrounds really where his home was in Massapequa Park, and then, of course, calls out to different areas around the greater New York area. So it all the puzzle all kind of came together, and it all pointed towards architect Rex Heuermann, who lived and worked there. So they kind of put all those pieces together.
And at that point, that's when all of the clues surrounding the burner phone usage lined up as well.
Sure.
So these burner phones were used to contact the victims. They were active in the same places that Heuermann was at the time that the calls were made, Massapequa Park and Midtown Manhattan. And investigators were also able to discover that the calls initiated by the burner phone happened when Rex Heuermann was in those areas and never at a point of time that he was not, which leads prosecutors to make those connections that he was the one that was initiating those calls. They also said that the phones of Melissa, Maureen, and Amber were used after the women disappeared to check to check voicemail and make those calls, and that those post-disappearance calls again tracked Heuermann's geographic footprint. So this takes us to the evening of July 13th, 2023, where Rex Heuermann is finally arrested and taken into custody on Fifth Avenue, just outside of his office. The surveillance video shows him walking out of the steps of the building, calmly, collected. And in fact, I think that what I found most interesting about that moment in time was the lack of surprise, and that he actually had no idea that he was being surveilled for as long as he was. And he also had no idea that he was the prime suspect in the Gilgo Beach murders.
Yeah, so what happened is Amber's case actually was a major digital break for them, because again, they found that direct link between Heuermann and Costello's webpage. So even though he had tried to wipe his computer, they said he tried to wipe and scrub his computer, but they were still able to, to pull it up, even though he had tried to do that. So they determined that he was not only the one who came to her house the first time, but he was actually the one who came back a second time. He made the mistake of carrying around in his pocket his personal cell phone, as he was carrying these other cell phones with him. And so that really was what connected all the dots as well. So, then they got search warrants. They got warrants to go through his office, and they came upon a lot of his different items. They got into his devices. They had like 350 electronic devices that they were able to seize in the process of doing all this.
That's 350.
350.
Wow.
Between his office and his home. And then they also found 300 plus guns in a vault in his home.
Wow.
So the Chevy Avalanche was actually found on a property that he owned in South Carolina. So here we are with all this stuff going on. And then they said their analysis of the electronic devices sort of revealed his going on sites that were bondage, torture, pornography, and all that sort of stuff, going all the way back to 1994. And it also included like mutilation and stuff that would show him how to do the different dismemberment acts that he did with these women. So, and it really tied into Sandra Castillo, her murder, Jessica Taylor, Valerie Mack. All of those were sort of done similarly to all of this information that he was viewing on these electronic devices. And so they also found searches about the victims themselves. He had searched them out. He had been looking at their families, like Facebooks and what have you. And he also was checking on the status of the investigation. So it's surprising he didn't know that he was a suspect. But he also did a lot of research about serial killers and forensic wiping tools. So he was pretty well in the weeds on this stuff. And then there was this really significant document that they found among all of his stuff. It was actually on a hard drive that he had tried to scrub, and it was recovered in his basement. It was almost like a how-to. It was a planning blueprint. So it showed, the pre-prep, the prep, the time, what do you do once you've got the victim, the supplies you would need, the post-event, notes about, going and reconning video cameras, what type of rope to use, saws, tape, I mean, you name it, gloves, drop cloths, and things like that to prevent your own DNA becoming part of the remains that you left behind.
And this is a full comprehensive document that he had created.
Right. It even went into removing ID type of stuff like tattoos and things, scars and things of that nature. And it was really, it even included get enough sleep. Here's what you do to control the victim. Here's how you destroy files. And then even having a story ready when you're done. So it was really an ABCs of killing women. He created this document. And so the task force believed that the document reflected Heuermann's, education, if you will, of how to do this. And then it included notes like controlling noise and things like that. And then prosecutors would later argue that the language about removing heads and hands and tattoos, again, tied into very similar features that they found with the remains of Jessica Taylor and, of course, Valerie Mack. So it's hard to overstate how important this document was. It kind of takes away the image of anything spontaneous.
Yes.
Where he might have gotten out of control and killed one or two of these women, and really speaks very heavily to the premeditation in these cases. So they used over 300 subpoenas. I can imagine the paperwork in this case. And they put it all together. They pulled in the old witnesses. They looked at the box area. They had the pizza crust. They had the Chevy Avalanche, the DNA from the hairs. And so they also had the planning file and the digital history. And so what was interesting, too, is a lot of this all tied into the family travel windows. His wife was from Iceland, and she would, every summer, from June to the end of July, she would take the children to Iceland to visit family. So all of this tied into those timelines as well.
It was the perfect opportunity for him to execute these horrible crimes.
Sure. So then, nearly 3 years after he was arrested, as you mentioned, he kept saying, I'm not guilty. I didn't do anything. I don't know these women. I have no idea what you're talking about. And then suddenly, on April 8th, 2026, he walks into a courtroom and he confesses and pleads guilty to first-degree murder of three counts of first-degree murder, 4 counts of second-degree murder, and then he also confesses to killing Karen Vergata. They didn't even know anything about her. So he told the judge that he had strangled them and he had dismembered them and discarded their bodies in Manorville and Gilgo Beach area and wrapped them in burlap. And so, this confession wasn't televised. He didn't speak to the victims' families or any of that. He just simply walked in, made his confession, and walked out. And his lawyer then said that he would cooperate with the FBI's behavioral analysis group. So then, under the plea, he gets, I think he got 3 years without parole for the murders. So he has not 3 years, but 3 consecutive life sentences.
Mm-hmm.
And then he had another sentence of 100 years that he would serve at the same time without parole. And so the sentencing is actually the official sentencing where the judge gavels what he agreed to is in June of this year. So we'll watch for that.
I think is so remarkable is that all of this is happening in real time, and that this is something that has gone on for 30 years and still is in the process of reaching its ending.
Yeah, and so now we're lucky enough to have Stephen Berger, who's going to come on and join us here. And, I have a lot of questions for him. How all this stuff went on for so long. It just took forever.
Joining us now is Detective Stephen Berger, who is a retired NYPD detective with the cold case unit and most notably a first-grade detective with a very distinct honor. Thank you so much for being here with us, Detective Berger.
Yeah, it's great to see you again.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
So, we've been digging into the Gilgo Beach murders, as you know. And one of the things that kind of bothered me through this whole case, because it spans over like 20 years, how did this guy go undetected for so long? I mean, they had no idea even who he was.
Yeah. The guy led a normal life. He was a family guy. He had a job in Manhattan. He had a family on Long Island. He didn't have a criminal record, so his DNA was never in the database. And any kind of DNA that was recovered from these young ladies, they had nothing to match it up to, because his DNA wasn't in the system, as I said.
So were the girls even reported missing, all of them, or was it just that, he'd never been arrested and so you didn't have anything to go by?
Well, some of the girls were reported missing, not all of them. But first of all, if you don't have they didn't have any kind of bodies. The bodies were recovered, years later. So the police really had nothing to go by at that point until, they started finding some of these girls up in the marshes over there.
Is it common that somebody that is responsible for these type of crimes wouldn't have a prior record? Do you see that often?
It happens. Is it common? A lot of, it's not common, but it definitely does happen that there are people that commit crimes that for the first time that they're not in the they never submitted DNA, and they have the police have nobody to compare it with. If they have foreign DNA at a scene, they need a subject to compare it to.
Sure. So now, the Gilgo Beach area, I'm not from that area, so I haven't, and I've never been to that area. What makes it so hard to find these remains? I mean, you'd think somebody walking their dog or something would have found them before that.
Yeah, no, it's in that by Ocean Parkway over there. It's a long stretch it's all beaches along the South Shore on Long Island, and you go down this road. It's marshes on both sides, and it makes it's treacherous terrain, and it's difficult. You don't go walking in there. You can't walk in there, and unless the police have a reason to go in there, they're not going to go in there.
So it was really the Shannon Gilbert situation where she's calling, she's frantic, she's on this 911 call, and they're looking for her, and that sort of drove them into the marshes. Otherwise, they wouldn't even go in there, right?
Probably not. And yeah, that jump started this whole investigation, and it had nothing to do with it, right?
So, was there any evidence that you kind of felt like they should have sort of keyed in on early on? Or was there anything that sort of stood out when you were looking at some of the stuff that they had reviewed?
I'm sorry, but what point are you talking about? Because once the police had once they found some of these victims, and now they had something to work with. Before they had the actual the bodies were
Right.
recovered, they had nothing to work with.
So now
So
they've
I'm not sure with your question that
well,
you're
when
asking.
they've found the bodies,
Right.
it's sort of where do they go from there? I mean, what's kind of that process? Is there some sort of a way that you kind of develop a background on these people, or how do you
Sure.
guys kind of go about your?
Well, the first thing you find remains, you got to try to identify who this person is, and you do that through the advanced DNA testing. And once you have the person identified, and now you could do a victimology on the person, learn their life, what they were about, and track down family members. And that's basically what the police did. Once they got them identified, they were able to you know you know get all the information that they need to jumpstart this investigation.
So are the families usually cooperative when this happens,
Of
or are
course,
they
of,
sort of like, no, you can't have her computer, you can't have, does it usually go fairly smoothly, or is it really a process of really kind of dealing with these people who've gone through this tragic situation, and now you've got these remains and you need their help?
well, their loved ones. Why wouldn't their loved ones want to cooperate with the police?
Right.
I mean, if this case, they were out there, the family members, fighting for their loved ones to get closer to, who killed their loved one. Yeah, families are very receptive to the police mostly, and they help us out. And whether it's obtaining their social media, cell phones, or whatever the police need, it's usually not an issue.
What do you think the most compelling pieces of evidence were in this case? Would you say that it was the usage of the burner phones and those cell phone records? What do you think was what really brought it all together?
Oh, there's so much compelling. First of all, yeah, the burner phone, and then once he was identified, now we have a suspect, and now they his personal phone with the burner phone, and how they ping to all the same locations that and
Right.
they realized, before they actually had him identified, through when they through digital, the cell phones of the victims
Mm-hmm.
uh, that they extracted from their phone records. They determined that this guy, was, worked in Manhattan. He lived in Long Island. So now, once they have a guy identified, now, wow, his they see his personal cell phone. It follows the burner phone all over the place, and naturally, the guy's going to have his personal phone on him because, hey, he has a job, he has a family, and what
Yeah.
happens if the wife he calls? And he has to pick up the phone when the wife calls. So, you know, and that's a great piece of evidence right there. Also, the DNA. There was DNA. There were his hairs were found on a victim or so, and now they have now they have DNA from, they have hair. Now they have something to compare that DNA to. They have, they did surveillance for a long period of time, and they did an unbelievable job, these guys, and doing surveillance with, being very persistent, until they finally found that, this guy threw out what did he throw out?
Threw out a pizza box.
Right. And now, the guy didn't, he had crust left, which I never would leave crust. Like, that's the best part of the pizza. But anyway, he had crust, and now they were able to extrapolate DNA from that, from the crust, and they masked it to the hair that was found on one of the victims, and bang. And that's another great piece of evidence. And
I think that is just
great job these
absolutely,
guys did.
it's just absolutely remarkable investigative work. And like you said, the fact that he was being surveilled for so long, I mean, that's what really stood out to me, is that at the time of his arrest, Rex Heuermann had no idea that he was even a suspect in this case.
He was pretty cocky.
Well, he knew he was a suspect because he did it. And
yeah.
And you know what else? What else was really fascinating? What they did, because it definitely something that we did in my unit. When they, I guess this case went on for so long, and there were different administrations that were involved, and at the end, the police commission and district attorney's office, what they did, they digitalized, and I heard an interview that they digitalized all the evidence in this case, that's unbelievable. And pretty much what that is, this case is so big, and there's so much like that goes into a case. Like, there's thousands of pieces of paper and interviews and all this stuff. And what they did, they made it readable, that it's more, or they organize it. And that's a big part of being a detective, especially in homicides, like case management. And it just makes it easy so you don't miss nothing. And they did that, and that's brilliant. And from that, they were able to they were able to see all the interviews and everything that was done. And through that, the interview that was done how many years before,
30 years.
One of the roommates of the victim,
yes,
one of the victims, seen this guy, a big 6'8" guy, older looking guy with a pickup truck. And now they were able to, the detectives in that area in Massapequa Park, I guess, they were able to, with that interview, they were able to locate, because this guy stands out, no doubt. And they were able to, once they were able to locate this car, and now they do all the DMV database, they get all the information on the car, and now they got the guy. And from that, they were able to go to the next step, the next part of the puzzle, and they put together an unbelievable case, these guys. And this guy is in jail now.
The fact that they were able to, like you said, digitize 30 years of information about this case is remarkable. And I think that, obviously the technology having caught up to the times that allowed the police department to do that is definitely what put it in the right direction.
Yeah, I imagine that once they said, okay, do you see this? Do you see all of the evidence, that they've got? I think that's probably what caused him to confess. Now, question, that kind of evidence, is that what you guys classify as circumstantial, or how does that work?
No, it's DNA and stuff is not circumstantial. I mean, there was just there is circumstantial evidence in this case, but it's more than that. Also, I would have to say, I'm not sure, but I'm sure, like, when they did that interview with when those roommates of the one of the victims, they interviewed them, I'm sure that they did some kind of identification procedure, and just, is this the guy that you've seen in the house? And so that's, that lineup, I'm sure they did lineups and photo arrays and stuff like that. I would imagine that's one of the procedures that they did.
Yeah, he would definitely stand out in a lineup, I would think. I mean, hard not
so
to say.
identifiable.
Oh, yeah.
Well, they have to. They just can't. They would put similar, You
Kind of
just
guys
don't
next
when
to
you do.
him.
Yeah, you don't do when you do a photo identification and stuff. You gotta have similar looking people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you can't make it has to be fair.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so then how did they keep him in jail for so long? I mean, so he's arrested in 2023,
Mm-hmm.
and then he was still in jail. He never was released, was he?
Once he got arrested,
Right.
no, he's in jail. I mean, you're in jail. You will wait a trial, but obviously this case never made it to a trial. So now he's in jail awaiting his sentencing. I think his sentencing is sometime next month, maybe.
Yeah, the sentencing is
Not
In
sure.
June.
set for June of 2026.
Oh,
On the
it is?
And on the
17th,
17th. And that brings me to a question that I'm sure a lot of people want to know, which is what prompts this kind of confession? What prompts this kind of confession? Why would somebody go up and confess rather than go on trial? Was it because there was so much evidence against him? What do you think?
Oh, sure. I mean, if I'm his lawyer, sure. The evidence on him is incredible. There's so much evidence on this guy. Also, I mean, he might have admitted to these homicides. What did he admit to? Eight homicides, I think. He avoiding, well, in New York State. I don't think we have the death penalty anymore. So yeah, uh, so much evidence on him. Maybe his conscience. I don't know.
Yeah. So, I mean, it just sounds like he avoided a lot of headache by confessing. And so
Yeah, he did it. I mean,
now
I'm
does
sure
the
he would
judge usually
representation.
automatically, when they do a plea bargain like that, so you've got this guy in jail, and I'm sure the arresting officers have to show up, don't they? Or the guys that did the
No, the
investigation?
arresting officer doesn't show up for they show up if it goes to a trial, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Grand jury maybe.
So do they
But
come to court on the formal sentencing or the
sentencing,
acceptance
yeah,
of the
you
plea?
you
Okay.
can if you want. That's probably up to the detective if he wants to show up to the sentencing. But yeah, sure, because you might have the victim's families are going to be there.
Sure.
They might want to read an impact statement, something like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I found to be really interesting was that not every count of murder that he was charged with was classified as first-degree murder.
Right.
And from what I
Right.
understand, first degree compared to second degree varies state by state. What can you tell me about the fact that he was charged with some first-degree murders and some second-degree murders when it came down to his killing spree?
Well, I mean, first degree murder is premeditated. It's and there's a lot of different subdivisions, and the subdivision that applies to this case probably is that being a serial killer.
Mhm.
The
I
special
mean, he was
circumstances.
killing. I guess some of the murders that he did were in a similar manner. So and within a certain time frame. I know there's a certain time frame. So those they were able to charge him, and the other ones, second degree, they weren't able to. It didn't fall into that criteria of that time frame, and that they were similar. Because I believe a lot of the murders that he did, they weren't exactly. He didn't go. They weren't killed the same way. Some of them were dismembered. Some of them were whole. Their bodies were intact and stuff. So I imagine that's the reason why.
Detective Berger, thank you so much for being here again with us on another episode. We so appreciate your insight and your expertise, and we're looking forward to the next time that you come back and see us.
Good to see
All
you
right.
again.
Thanks for having me.
Of course.
So the real story of Gilgo Beach is about the women. These women were vulnerable. Their disappearances didn't receive the kind of attention that it deserved. And maybe that is really kind of the final truth in this case. Evil doesn't always come to you, being obvious in nature. Kind of lives outside the routine of ordinary life until one day the evidence catches up and that ghost on the beach actually becomes a name in court.
If you've enjoyed this episode, we would love to hear what you have to say. Go ahead, like, comment, subscribe below. What did you find most fascinating about this case, about how the evidence lagged for so long, how prosecutors didn't pick up the pieces for nearly 30 years? What would you have done if somebody had picked up your phone and called your 15-year-old little sister? Tell us below.
So until next time, stay safe, my friends, and join Jocelyn and I next week as we examine another unlawful act.